Parker Schnabel had launched one of the boldest moves of his gold mining career, and the stakes could not have been higher. His plan was simple in theory, but nearly impossible in practice. Operate 3 wash plants at once, Big Red, Roxanne, and Good Old Bob, each feeding into one central gold room. Every ounce counted. Every minute mattered. The goal was massive, 10,000 ounces for the season, but the reality was brutal. The 3-pronged strategy had put the entire operation on the edge, and the pressure was falling on one man more than anyone else. Chris Doumitt, the gold guru of the crew, was the linchpin. Everything had to pass through him. Every ounce of gold concentrate had to be cleaned, processed, and recorded before the plants could keep running. If Chris slowed down, the plant slowed down, and the whole season could collapse. Chris Doumitt had been a loyal veteran for years. He had worked long, grueling hours, trained countless new operators, and had seen every kind of problem the North could throw at a mining crew. But this season, the workload had reached a breaking point. The 3-plant strategy meant moving between sites, handling dozens of SRL boxes, cleaning mats that weighed over 50 pounds each, and managing water pressure in the gold room, all while keeping an eye on the delicate details that separated valuable gold from useless tailings. He was doing the work of 3 men, and the toll on his body and mind was obvious. Every morning, the coffee and cigars that had once fueled him did little to keep the fatigue away. Every day, the same rhythm. Big Red yesterday, Roxanne today, Bob's tomorrow. There was no break, no pause, no relief. The work was relentless, and Chris had reached the point where he had to admit it. He could not keep up forever. It all came to a head one frozen morning when Chris walked across the camp toward Roxanne with another SRL box in his hands. His movements were slower than usual, the strain visible in his back, his shoulders heavy, and his steps labored. The wind cut through the camp, but it was nothing compared to the invisible weight pressing down on him. He knew that if he did not speak up, if he continued to push himself, he could cause a catastrophic bottleneck that would jam the entire operation. And in mining, a bottleneck was more than an inconvenience. It could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And for Parker, it could jeopardize the season entirely. Chris's loyalty had always pushed him to work harder, to endure longer than anyone else. But even he had limits. When Chris finally confronted Parker, the tension was immediate. Parker could see the exhaustion in Chris's eyes, the way his hands shook slightly as he gestured toward the containers of concentrate from Big Red and Roxanne. Then he pointed toward Bob's, which was still scheduled for the next day. The message was clear. He could manage 2 plants, maybe, but 3 was beyond his capacity. Parker understood instantly. Chris was not complaining. He was giving a warning. The reality of the operation had collided with human limits. Every solution Parker considered came with consequences. He could assign someone else to help, but who could he spare? Damien was a critical part of the field operation. Tomo was essential where he was. The options were shrinking fast, and the clock was not slowing down. Chris then said a name that made Parker pause. Tatiana, one of the crew's most skilled operators. Pulling her from the field would be a sacrifice in itself, removing one of the team's strongest members from a vital operation. But it would save the gold room and Chris from being pushed past his breaking point. Parker hesitated. He knew the morale impact on the field crew would be significant. Mitch and Tyson would not be happy about losing Tatiana. But he also knew that losing Chris in the gold room would be far worse. The entire season depended on him. After a long pause, Parker made the decision. Tatiana would be reassigned to the gold room. Chris breathed a deep sigh of relief. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe, like the pressure that had been suffocating him was finally easing. The weight of the 3-plant gamble was still on Parker, but at least the linchpin, Chris Doumitt, was no longer alone. Training Tatiana was intense. The gold room was not just a place to pour dirt through machines. It was a science. Each mat had to be cleaned carefully. Every ounce of gold recovered, water pressure balanced, and sediment handled in a precise order. One small mistake could mean losing thousands of dollars in microscopic gold flakes. Chris guided Tatiana through every step, his experience showing in every word and motion.
She was a quick learner, precise and careful, and soon Chris could see that the trust he placed in her was not misplaced. With Tatiana taking over much of the gold room, Chris could finally focus on supervising the operation instead of doing every grueling task himself. However, Parker felt the squeeze elsewhere. The field was now one operator short, and the remaining crew had to work harder to feed the 3 plants. The sacrifice had eased one bottleneck, but created pressure somewhere else. It was a delicate balance, a careful dance between the gold room and the field. Every day was a test of stamina, logistics, and patience. Parker had gambled not only his gold targets, but also his relationships with his crew, and the outcome was still uncertain. Every ounce of gold counted, every decision carried weight, and every mistake could be catastrophic. The first week of the 3-plant operation proved just how high the stakes were. Big Red had started the week slowly, producing just 75 ounces after all the effort and fuel expended. It was a disappointing start, a far cry from the massive haul Parker had hoped for. The pressure on Chris and Tatiana was enormous, but the second plant, Roxanne, began to show promise. With careful management and precise handling, the second batch produced over 200 ounces. Relief spread through the gold room, but Parker knew they were still chasing the record. All eyes were on good old Bob, the plant furthest from camp, the one with the highest expectations. When the final container was poured into the pan, the scale jumped, climbed, and finally settled at 303 ounces. It was a record-breaking haul, more than Parker had dreamed of. The gamble had paid off. The sacrifice of Tatiana, the endurance of Chris, and the relentless effort of the crew across all 3 plants had culminated in the most successful week of the season. Nearly 600 ounces had been collected in total, worth almost $1.5 million. Every choice, every risk, and every ounce of effort had contributed to this moment. Parker's strategy had worked, Chris was no longer at his limit, and the crew had achieved something remarkable. Yet even in the triumph, Parker understood the fragility of the operation. The decision to pull Tatiana
eased one bottleneck, but left the field crew stretched thinner than ever. Every day forward would require careful planning, strict coordination, and constant attention. One mistake could undo everything. But for now, there was a moment to savor. Chris Doumitt had his lifeline, Tatiana had proven her worth, and Parker Schnabel had pulled off a gamble few would dare attempt. The gold was flowing, the record had been broken, and the 3-plant strategy had been validated. At least for this week. The week after the record-breaking haul started with a quiet intensity. The crew knew what was at stake. Every operator was aware that the success of the 3-plant strategy depended on precise coordination, constant effort, and careful management. Parker walked through the camp early in the morning, checking on each site. He stopped first at Big Red. The plant was already alive with activity. Diesel engines hummed, conveyors carried heavy loads of pay dirt, and the water pumps churned constantly to separate gold from gravel. Parker watched his crew work, noting efficiency and fatigue, knowing that every ounce that went through this plant was critical. He glanced at his radio, making mental notes of the distance to Roxanne and good old Bob. Timing was everything. In the gold room, Chris Doumitt and Tatiana were already at work. Tatiana had adapted quickly, her movements precise and careful. She lifted mats, drained water, and separated concentrates under Chris's watchful eye. Chris, although relieved to have help, still monitored everything meticulously. The gold room was unforgiving. A small error in water pressure, a miscalculation in mat cleaning, or a rushed step could mean losing fine gold that would never be recovered. Chris explained to Tatiana how to adjust the sluice boxes depending on the flow of water and the size of the gravel.
He showed her the subtle differences between the concentrates from Big Red, Roxanne, and Bob's, emphasizing how each plant had its unique challenges. Tatiana listened intently, absorbing every detail. Meanwhile, in the field, Parker faced the other side of the challenge. With Tatiana pulled from the cut, the field operators were stretched thin. Mitch and Tyson coordinated the digging and hauling, pushing equipment harder than usual. The terrain was difficult, frozen in places and muddy in others, and the distance between the plants required precise scheduling to ensure the ore reached the gold room without delay. Parker moved between sites, checking machines, trucks, and loaders, constantly solving problems before they turned
into disasters. The pressure was unrelenting, and every decision carried the weight of thousands of dollars. Midweek, the operation hit a critical moment. Big Red had slowed unexpectedly, and the conveyors began to clog with wet gravel. Parker rushed in, personally supervising the clearing of the jam. He directed the crew, coordinated repairs, and even helped lift hoses that were too heavy for one man alone. Meanwhile, Chris and Tatiana were working at a frantic pace in the gold room, trying to keep the concentrate from Big Red from piling up. Sweat streamed down their faces, and the air was thick with dust and anticipation. Every pan of gold they processed had to be accurate. Any mistake would ripple back through the operation, slowing the plants and endangering the season's goal. At Roxanne, the second plant, the operation was smoother but no less intense. The team had learned from previous weeks, and the flow of ore was consistent. Still, the scale at the gold room showed the pressure of volume. Chris carefully measured every ounce, cross-checking the totals and ensuring nothing was lost. Tatiana, now fully engaged in her role, had begun anticipating Chris's directions, moving in rhythm with his instructions. Her confidence and skill allowed Chris a brief moment to breathe, a rare luxury in these high-stakes operations. For Parker, seeing his gold guru regain control was a relief, but he could not let the field operations slip. Every machine, every operator, and every plan had to work in harmony. By Thursday, the strain was beginning to show. Chris admitted that he was still tired, though Tatiana had eased the most immediate pressure. He had to handle heavier loads than ever before, lifting and cleaning mats repeatedly, monitoring water levels, and keeping a constant eye on the scale. Tatiana handled much of the repetitive work, but the expertise required to keep the gold intact still rested on Chris's shoulders. He reminded Tatiana to check the smallest details, the clarity of the water, the flow of gravel, and the temperature of the gold room. Every small adjustment mattered, and he had little margin for error. Meanwhile, Parker faced logistical headaches. The remaining operators in the field were exhausted. Trucks broke down, frozen hoses cracked, and loaders stalled in the mud. He coordinated repairs, rearranged shifts, and ensured fuel and supplies reached every site. He knew that the success of the three-plant gamble was balanced on a knife's edge. One failure
In the field could mean the gold room would be overwhelmed, and the meticulous work Chris and Tatiana were doing would be for nothing. Parker made constant radio checks, giving instructions, encouraging his crew, and solving problems as they arose. On Friday, the first major test of the week came. Big Red produced a higher-than-expected volume of concentrate. The gold room quickly filled with boxes, and Chris had to move faster than ever. Tatiana responded with precision, handling multiple tasks at once. Chris guided her through complex adjustments, showing her how to keep the heavy gold from being lost with the tailings. The air was hot and dusty, every surface covered with fine particles of gold and dirt. They worked without pause, knowing that any delay would cause a backlog in the plants. At Roxanne, the haul was steady, but Bob's was the wild card. Good old Bob had the potential to deliver the largest single yield of the week. But it was also the furthest from the gold room. Coordination was essential. Parker ensured that the transport trucks were ready, fuel was stocked, and communication lines were clear. Every detail mattered. The last thing he could afford was a delay at Bob's, which would create a bottleneck at the gold room and undo all of Chris and Tatiana's careful work. By Saturday morning, the results began to take shape. Chris and Tatiana had processed the concentrate from Big Red and Roxanne successfully. The piles of gold in the gold room reflected hundreds of hours of hard labor. The room, normally hot and claustrophobic, now carried a sense of anticipation. Parker walked in, studying the piles, calculating in his head, feeling the tension that comes with chasing record numbers. The last batch from good old Bob would determine if the gamble had truly paid off. When the final container arrived from Bob's, the room went silent. Chris and Tatiana worked together to pour the concentrate into the pan. The scale began to climb, ounce by ounce. The numbers moved steadily, climbing past the totals from Big Red and Roxanne. The scale finally settled at 303.7 ounces. The room went quiet. Parker's eyes widened. The three-plant gamble had paid off beyond expectations. Nearly 600 ounces had been collected across the three plants, a record-breaking week worth over $1.5 million. The sacrifice of pulling Tatiana from the field had been justified, and Chris was finally able to breathe after weeks of relentless pressure. Even in the celebration, Parker knew the work was far from over. The field was still short-handed, and maintaining this level of production week after week would be a challenge. Every operator had to be at their best, every machine maintained, and every ounce of gold carefully accounted for. But for now, the proof was in the numbers. The three-plant gamble had worked. Chris was secure in the gold room, and the crew had achieved something extraordinary. Sunday morning on the claim brought a rare calm, but Parker knew better than to trust it. While the gold room was temporarily relieved, the field operators were still fatigued. Machines had run non-stop for 6 days, and crews were showing signs of strain. Parker moved between sites, checking trucks, loaders, and conveyors. Each site had its own challenges: frozen hoses at Big Red, clogged sluices at Roxanne, and mud-heavy dirt at good old Bob. Even small delays in the field could ripple back to the gold room and undo hours of meticulous processing. He took a moment to talk with the operators, reminding them that their work directly impacted the gold room. Morale was high after their record haul, but fatigue and stress were still present. Parker knew that leadership wasn't just about making decisions. It was about keeping the crew motivated when every day felt like a grind. Back in the gold room, Chris Doumitt and Tatiana were already at work again. Tatiana was growing more confident, understanding the nuances of gold recovery that even seasoned operators sometimes overlooked. She had learned to read the flow of water, the behavior of the gravel, and the subtle vibrations in the sluice boxes that indicated gold settling patterns. Chris continued to mentor her, showing her how to adjust the pressure, manipulate the mats, and handle the fine gold without losing a single flake. He was finally able to delegate small tasks, a relief that allowed him to focus on monitoring the bigger picture. Even with this help, the workload was immense, and Chris often found himself still lifting heavy mats and shoveling concentrates, the physical toll still pressing on him. Meanwhile, Parker returned to the field to assess the effects of pulling Tatiana out of active mining. Mitch and Tyson were managing the remaining operators, but the workload was heavier without one of their best team members. Parker watched them work, noting how the team adapted, how they compensated for the absence, and where gaps might appear in the system. Every day
Was a balance between pushing production and preventing burnout. He knew that losing efficiency in the field could undo all the careful work Chris and Tatiana were doing in the gold room. Parker also had to make sure equipment was functioning at peak performance. Diesel engines needed constant monitoring, loaders required daily maintenance, and conveyors had to be cleared of debris. Even small mechanical failures could cause cascading delays. By Monday, the operation had settled into a routine, but the intensity never wavered. Big Red continued to produce consistently. Roxanne had improved its efficiency,
and good old Bob was providing higher yields than ever. Parker rotated operators to keep them fresh, scheduled short maintenance windows, and adjusted workloads based on daily performance. Chris and Tatiana continued their precise work in the gold room, processing each batch with extreme care. The room was warm, dusty, and filled with anticipation every time a new batch arrived. Tatiana had developed a rhythm that complemented Chris's expertise, allowing the cleanup process to be faster without sacrificing accuracy. Tuesday brought new challenges. The weather turned unexpectedly, with heavy snow slowing truck travel between sites. Parker had to adjust logistics on the fly, coordinating drivers, rerouting ore, and ensuring the plants kept running. He communicated constantly with his foreman, making quick decisions to prevent bottlenecks. To prevent fatigue and maintain focus, understanding that even small errors in the gold room could cost thousands of dollars. Thursday morning brought a moment of tension. Big Red began producing an unusually high volume of concentrate, threatening to overwhelm the gold room. Chris and Tatiana worked at full speed, moving mats, adjusting water pressure, and monitoring the scale closely. Every ounce had to be accounted for, and mistakes could not be allowed. Parker coordinated with the field operators, ensuring they maintained a steady flow of ore to prevent sudden spikes. The operation was a delicate balance between speed and precision, and Parker's leadership was tested as never before. By Friday, the results were starting to show the fruits of their labor. Big Red and Roxanne had maintained consistent production, and good old Bob was exceeding expectations. Chris and Tatiana were working in perfect synchronization, each anticipating the other's movements, communicating silently, and keeping the workflow steady. Parker checked the weekly totals in the gold room, noting the impressive numbers. The sacrifice of removing Tatiana from the field had clearly paid off, at least for the gold room operation. However, Parker knew that sustaining this level of efficiency required constant vigilance and attention to detail. Saturday arrived with the promise of more gains, but also the risk of setbacks. Parker supervised the transport of concentrates from good old Bob, ensuring that trucks arrived on time and that the workflow remained uninterrupted. Chris and Tatiana processed the final batches for the week, carefully weighing each ounce of gold. The air in the gold room was thick with dust and anticipation. Every pour onto the scale was a reminder of the stakes. As the numbers climbed, the crew's excitement grew, but so did the tension. One small error could nullify an entire week's work. By the end of the week, the results were clear. The three-plant gamble had been a success, but not without cost. Parker had sacrificed a key operator from the field to protect the gold room, and the crew had been pushed to their limits. Chris Doumitt had received relief with Tatiana's help, but the physical and mental demands remained high. Parker reflected on the week's work, understanding that success in gold mining required constant adjustment, tough decisions, and the ability to adapt under pressure. The victory was significant, yet Parker knew the season was far from over. Each week would bring new challenges, from weather to equipment failures, operator fatigue, and logistical hurdles. The three-plant operation was a delicate balance that demanded leadership, strategy, and careful management. Chris and Tatiana had proven their ability to handle pressure, but the field crew would continue to face intense demands. Every day required vigilance, skill, and teamwork. Parker walked through the camp late Saturday evening, taking stock of the machines, the crew, and the upcoming week. He knew that keeping the operation running smoothly required constant attention and tough decision-making. Success was measured in ounces of gold, but it was built on the foundation of human effort, discipline, and resilience. Sunday night brought a new kind of challenge. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and the frost was settling over the claim. Parker inspected the machines personally, walking from Big Red to Roxanne to good old Bob. Each plant had its quirks in extreme cold, and even minor mechanical issues could cause major delays. At Big Red, he noticed a hydraulic line showing early signs of freezing. He called Mitch over and had the crew drain and relubricate it immediately.
Small problems like these could quickly turn into shutdowns if ignored, and Parker knew time was precious. Roxanne was operating smoothly, but good old Bob had a loader with a clogged radiator. Parker immediately redirected a spare loader to keep the plant moving while Mitch and Tyson worked on repairs. Every decision had a ripple